So welcome everyone for lecture 6 in our cloud computing and big data course, parallel and scalable machine learning. And this is what we will also do today. We advance from machine learning really to deep learning, which is a, let's say, sub area in machine learning as a whole. And we will learn about the dependencies. We'll learn about how it's different from the, let's say, more traditional approaches in machine learning, where deep learning really makes a difference. And the connection to the course is really that deep learning is driven by big data. So you would not use deep learning usually if you have less amounts of data, if you have little amounts of data. And another common element which also is connected to the course, of course, is then the computing blueprint that I will also introduce you today. But another element was the MapReduce paradigm. We finished this in the last couple of lectures, which was also a bit practical, if you remember. And this will be also part here, the deep learning of a practical lecture. But before we go then into the material of today and then the subsequent lectures with lecture 7 and practical lecture 7.1, which is relevant for your assignment 2, let's review what we had the last time. And the last time was another practical lecture built on lecture 5, which was more a conceptual approach to MapReduce understanding. And this is now very repetitive, so I will stop here. It's a traditional approach in computer science, as you may remember, with divide and conquer. But you also learned the way that basically the idea of, or the power of MapReduce comes really from 3 steps. It's not just map and reduce, as the name suggests. There's a hidden sort of feature in this, which is then the key value idea of doing grouping, shuffling, and sorting, which is usually done by the underlying framework. Could be Spark, can be Hadoop. But the key idea is really to have a sort of automatism in the way, and with this also comes with a different map and reduce task, sort of resilience, fault tolerance, if you remember in the earlier conceptual lectures, that if a map task will fail, it basically will be resubmitted, maybe to another data source. And the other concept was a little bit the data locality, which was important, right? So, and we have learned in the last lecture when we then setting this up in the Amazon space, which we introduced already, a little bit like this conceptual idea you have here. So in Amazon, you would see there's some computing entities, they call that EC2. And EC2 can be many things. It can be GPU resources, can be memory intensive resources, can be powerful cutting edge CPUs. So in a way, this is something you choose from the catalog of available resources, and you go there and pay the price for it. If you remember, for Apache Spark, the idea was having memory intensive applications. Hence, we need EC2 resources, which, if you want to leverage the benefit, should be very, let's say, memory strong. But then, of course, you also pay the price for it. The news that we introduced then in lecture 5.1, in addition to that, was a little bit to give light to the S3 bucket store. And S3, if you want, is by now a sort of de facto standard in the cloud community. That's not completely true, because a standard is usually driven by ISO, driven by independent bodies. But that's why we call it de facto standard, that the S3 interface is implemented in very many applications and also used in many applications. Hence, people seek interoperability with the S3 interface for many different applications or even different cloud vendors. So we introduced this a little bit, if you remember, in the last course hours, when we said, okay, we wanted to have a cluster in HD Insight. That was not new to you. We have done this before in lecture 3.1. In the practical lecture, it's part of your assignment, and you know you have some waiting time until it's up and running, and this is an important part here. But then we also quickly showed that with Amazon EMR, you have essentially a very similar interface as well. Right, so when you go then from HD Insight to move to the Amazon Elastic MapReduce, you have also this big data stacks that are available, like Hive, for instance, or Spark, Hadoop, and so on. And this shows also that this is a sort of standard set in big data processing in the world of high throughput computing, right? So I said also earlier to you in the course, always there is a sort of complementary area for big data analysis, which is high performance computing, HPC, which has a completely fundamentally different idea of how to work with big data, also using cutting edge compute, but they interact a lot, right? So you would say lots of interactions between every different task. While here we see a major difference in this cloud computing of being HTC. So you would, as I said earlier, divide a problem independently, working on it, and then conquer it, summary statistics, getting it back together. And that's what the reduced tasks are for. So long story short, we learned a little bit in the last lecture how we do this now then in the EMR space, which are very comparable in a way to HD Insight. Also, the resources you take, everything costs, right? If you remember, so we had this interesting key pair set up for a different region that is very important in Amazon to really put it in different regions. And then we could reuse it to create an EMR space. And this EC2 then enables us to log in, or as you have seen a little bit with Jupyter Notebooks, there's a similar access as in HD Insight that you use in your assignment now, also for the EMR space. Hence, these cloud vendors have always something in common in this area. They differentiate a lot on the on-top services, something like AWS SageMaker, for instance. We will come to this in later lectures when we have a really more SaaS level machine learning product that is based on the underlying, let's say, resources that you have here in EC2 and S3. Something like this is not directly available in HD Insight. There are similar services, however, but this is something what we will also later on will explore. At the end of the lecture, we had another interesting MapReduce application. If you want, we had this idea of breaking up a Spark application into again, food inspection data. So that's why we created a bucket store, having not only the food inspection data itself, so basically who was violating with blue or red violations, which restaurant and in what manner. We also uploaded a Python script, and that was the idea of showing in the last lecture a little bit that not everything has to be essentially directly in the Jupyter Notebook, interactively done. Also, lots of these cloud applications have sort of a batch processing, have sort of an idea of doing this in an automated fashion. We did it with steps, if you remember computing steps, add step, and so on in the last lecture, to then create in the output folder here in something which is then processed without even the human seeing it, right? So we didn't had any cell executed like we do in Jupyter Labs. We basically just said this is to be computed, let it be 1 terabyte, and in 3 nights we have maybe the solution. I don't care, I don't want to look at it. The only reason I'm interested is I want to have the summary, and that's what we got then in the output folder. In our example, it was not terabytes, assumedly, but you can see in the production in the company, nobody wants really to work on terabytes on data and have an interactive channel necessarily. Hence, many of these things are behind the scene and also fault tolerant, because when I overnight, sleep and the terabytes are processed in the summary statistics to give me the most red violations, as we had here, for instance, but maybe in our examples, this was just a couple of restaurants, but they want to have terabytes. If a couple of these things fail, I don't want to stand up at 2 o'clock at night and correct that, right? Hence, the fault tolerance comes into the game again. So MapReduce tasks will maybe fail. The data is not available for some reason. The network interconnectivity is down temporarily in the cloud center. So they will resubmit and resubmit and resubmit during the night until the job is done. And this is something where also this MapReduce, or the larger picture really of this open source frameworks really count with Hadoop, Spark, and so on. So in order to advance in the course now, you will do some of these parts again in your assignment 2 as well. We want to advance a little bit into our machine learning journey, where we start a little bit with logistic regression. We started with simple learning models really at the beginning of the course, right? To get you basically a head start in machine learning without any big prerequisites. Also today, we will continue with a moderate introduction to deep learning. We'll make some connection to the cloud, of course, while you see in lecture 7, we go much more into the clouds, and there will be also practical lecture 7.1. Again, basically alluding to what you have to do in assignment 2. Hence, today will be a moderate introduction. And if you remember, we had started from the linear learning model. We will revisit this a little bit and see also this handwritten character recognition that we then at that time used a little bit. We have to learn a few elements of it. One of it is actually that it's 2D and not 1D. And what does that mean for a classifier is something what we learned in the first part. When we then thinking about this individual ingredients that we called perceptron in the past, in lecture 2 and lecture 3 and so on, and the linear learning models were all making use of it. The idea is combining those with neurons in different artificial neural networks with many different layers, many different neurons, and we make a case for it. So we will move from, let's say, the simple perceptron model to a multi-output perceptron model, and then come quickly to the, let's say, key idea of artificial neural networks, which gave rise to it, which was a backpropagation of error. Of course, normal university lectures, when I would teach machine learning as a whole, backpropagation alone and artificial neural networks alone would have a lecture series of maybe 3 lectures or 4. They're very important concepts in machine learning, and as I told you also here, we cannot go in all the details here, but I will still encourage you to take one of these machine learning courses we offer at the university to get more understanding of this. When I would be in class with you, I would ask who is actually taking now basically courses with Stain, for instance, one of my colleagues here. He is teaching this much more in detail, and the same concepts remain here, right? So this is just more a, let's say, crash course of machine learning, because we want to make the point, where's the big data and where's the processing power in clouds for it. So once we have done the basics of INN, which are not really deep learning, and we will talk about where the difference is, we come to a topic which is called convolutional neural network. And the key idea here is that you have a concrete deep learning model to learn from. Deep learning by now has been extremely successful. We have lots of applications with autoencoders, with transformers in Earth observation, remote sensing. We do this for natural language processing with large language models. We have lots of success for deep learning, so hence it would actually fill a whole different course again of how you can use deep learning today. So the idea of convolutional neural networks is to give you one of the concrete models, which is relatively straightforward to understand, and is also making the case how deep learning is essentially different from, let's say, the traditional artificial neural network approach. And we will take our example of MNIST, this character recognition, with us the whole course today in part 1 and part 2. And then we'll also learn a little bit the idea what now this model gives us, let's say, benefits when using deep learning at this kind of problem. But you can imagine that this problem, of course, stands for a many variety of applications throughout many different science and engineering problems. One thing we want to touch upon before we leave that space, also to make connections to later lectures, is then the hyperparameter complexity. Optimizers to choose from, how many layers, how big should the convolutional window be. So there are some elements which we will come back later when we talk about hyperparameter optimization techniques in one of the later lectures in the course, where you see that the accuracy, or let's say the error rates, depending on these hyperparameters, is crucial. So starting now with artificial neural networks, again, I would ask in the crowd normally in the class and say, well, who has worked with artificial neural networks before? And this is a topic which is quite old, so it's not so recent that this has been now coming back to the surface. This is a technique that is dating back to the 70s and 80s, and then found also several drawbacks in basically being very compute intensive if you add more and more layers, and then at some point in time leading to winter in machine learning, and now being revisited a little bit with deep learning. But key ideas remain. And of course, for machine learning, we want to connect a little bit what we learned before to show you the examples again. So again, supervised learning stands for the idea that we have, I always gave this label here that's guiding our input. And we had this, if you remember, with Iris setosa and Iris virginica. So, and this was the example we had, a new flower, let's say very straightforward problem in machine learning. And we were thinking about a decision boundary that now says, okay, it's class A, class B, Iris setona, Iris virginica. And there was basically the idea that we can learn from the existing examples. We know what it is. That makes it a supervised learning problem. I have also quite some samples of it. We had here 100 samples overall, standing for the petal width and petal length and so on, in the features that is basically constituting our vector X here. And then depending on this vector, I have a guiding label saying it's Iris setosa or Iris virginica. And then I had this idea of a machine learning algorithm that, if you remember, was a little bit this linear learning model, right? We learned the perceptron model. And this was then playing around with the decision boundary by adding or subtracting a vector. If you remember, going iteratively through all of these different, let's say, examples, and then at some point in time converge if the data is linearly separable, what we have here, right? So basically, if there would be one orange point here, that would be very difficult for this algorithm, and the other way around as well. Hence, we are looking for, let's say, more general solutions, for more robust solutions where maybe the data has not to be, let's say, linearly separable, or the boundary, if you want, will be maybe a little bit non-linear, or we catch non-linearity, if you want, with this data. And this is now where we start to advance a little bit. So here you have the, let's say, the basics that we learned the last time. We had the perceptron model. You know, we had always this kind of weights we actually learn over time. We sum them up linearly using weights here with our input data, which was constants, if you remember, that is our data set. And then given that we have the output, we could always see if we are correct or not with this. And we have this nonlinear activation function that we now introduce. At that point in time, we just had a simple sign function saying class A or class B. But if you're more generally speaking, that's now where, let's say, we go to more nonlinear elements of introducing nonlinear activation functions. So having done this, we come back to this in a moment. We also stay with one of our earlier introduced applications. So we would have here the character recognition data set, which is quite known, called MNIST. You have this 10 class problem, right? So now we're talking not about one class versus the other, not Iris setosa or Iris virginica. We want to understand when you have a handwritten image, what digit is actually shown. So we have 0 to 9, making it a 10 class problem. And there are different elements how you can introduce this in your applications concretely. One is you use it from Keras because it's already introduced in many of the data sets alongside these packages that you have already learned in machine learning, in deep learning. They provide you, especially with this MNIST data set. Looking more closer, and that's what we want to do now, it is basically a 28 by 28 pixel image with grayscale, making it then these interesting pictures you have here. So let's look more deeply how that works when you do this. And if you remember the CRISP-BM and earlier things where I said, like, first we do some data inspection, data understanding. So we look how this actually really looks like when you go into this data set. Hence, we have here these training examples. Like before, we will cut some of them, making it a training set, and another one making it a test set. So by doing so and looking into it, we see here again the 28 by 28. So we have a 2D problem here. That's important to understand, right? So 2D, and there's this grayscale where you say, okay, you have here a 5, I have a 0 here. That is something I can even recognize. And someone nicely has labeled that for us, making it a supervised learning problem. So by having this input, I want to understand if it's really a 2, a 5, a 6, or whatever. Of course, by doing so, we want to understand if you really match what people have said about the label. So there are different deep learning frameworks, how we can do it. There's PyTorch as well these days, which is incredibly used in my research group, and which is then also basically the idea of many different solutions which have here and there some unique selling proposition, like TensorFlow or Keras here as well. If you want, TensorFlow lets you much more control on the actual tensors flowing. So as the name suggests, and we will learn what the tensors are later on in deep learning, for instance. It's basically standing for multidimensional arrays if you want, but we come back to this. And they're already optimized for execution on CPUs, but also more notably these days on GPUs. Now, Keras is a much more higher level framework. It's basically sitting on top of TensorFlow, if you will. And we will use that a little bit because it has nicely, let's say, a nice way for teaching, introducing to the concepts of layers and make the case for it. But of course, deep learning can be done in PyTorch. These days, my research group uses, for instance, also DeepSpeed, right, which is another framework quite interesting to look at. So We base a little bit our assumptions here, and you can try them out in the Google Collaboratory, of course. So many of the examples that are there are using Google Collaboratory. As we had earlier already, you can also have a GPU there, but then you're really limited to small scale problems. And of course, our idea is then with lecture 7.1, to show you really with distributed deep learning how you can go big. And then, the Google Collaboratory will not really help you anymore. But to basically have the first little pieces with CNNs, with ANNs, with the idea of deep learning understood, Google Collaboratory is still a quite nice way to go. Obviously, when you now go to the cloud, you can imagine that similar things exist, right? So the only difference is that they are becoming more scalable, right? So you can interconnect them and so on. To make here a case, the EC2 that we discussed, the Elastic Compute Cloud, can be used with virtual machines. And virtual machines is something what I already introduced in one of the earlier lectures when we talked about this virtual layer and so on, and the pre-installed software that you have in an image. Hence, Amazon, for instance, called them Amazon Machine Images. And the beauty is there that you have already, let's say, a lot of this important software that you need for deep learning pre-configured and usable. And you see that here as an example. MXNet is another deep learning tool. TensorFlow is a well-known tool. PyTorch is a well-known tool, as I was alluding to. But you have also the, let's say, underlying relationships that you need. NVIDIA, for instance, CUDA. Every NVIDIA GPU is fueled by CUDA. That's the programming language. And then you have the different underlying NCCL interfaces in cuDNN, which again fuel deep learning with lots of good implementations on the lower level. And this all needs to work together in order to have, let's say, powerful deep learning applications run. And of course, now that's where the, let's say, the USP, the unique selling proposition from the cloud comes in. This is all pre-configured. If you have to do it on your own, you have to make sure that TensorFlow works with the right version of Python, with the right set of PyTorch, etc., etc. So that's where the cloud comes in. And of course, later on, we will also in lecture 7 and 7.1, as I said, think about how we then really do distributed deep learning. So not only one node, so to speak. But let's go, bottom up again, as I promised in the course. When you don't know much about deep learning, we will start very shallow with the ANNs, and then we'll advance now to deep learning in the second part of the course. And we want to have a guiding light example, which is our MNIST we already was, where, let's say, looking at. So here, we're using Keras and the APIs for loading the data. We're putting them in a training and test set. Both of them have this guiding label Y I was alluding to. And then I do just a small exploration script very early on to understand now how that looks like. I can do this in Jupyter notebooks, for instance, very nicely, where I immediately get the output, and it's no surprise. It looks like what we had before, the kind of 28 by 28 pixels. And then for each of the pixel, we would have the gray value intensity. So I show that I can look at this, and with this have, of course, a better understanding of what the data is. And for us, that's already important because this shows us it's a 2D problem I was alluding to. And this is something which is often performed in machine learning. So data inspection, data exploration, and so on, which is also important. And when you do so in Jupyter, you have to have the right kernels that, of course, then also have this Keras data sets, Keras as a, let's say, deep learning package involved. And there are many different versions of this. You see here one example, but when you use Jupyter notebooks and you have partly used that already, make sure you have the right, let's say, kernels. It's very similar like we had this PyTorch, right? To have this PyTorch kernels to make use of basically this environment. Going forward, we want to come back to the idea of a 2D problem. So what I told you in the linear learning model space, this was, having the perceptual learning model, sum the weights up linearly, or sum the inputs up really linearly using weights. This is what we learn, and then basically put them to a sort of activation function, and then you have this guiding label Y or not, and you can, have an update on the weights, and hopefully the next time it will be, which is a learning process. However, you see it's a 2D problem while we specified a 1D input. Hence, we need something we call reshaping, some would call it vectorizing, to one long vector, the input value. So when you do this, right? So in thinking about a 2D problem where we're now putting in a very long vector, my usual question in class is, what would you lose, right? And because we're online today, I would say what you lose is basically the neighborhood, right, of these pixels. And by keeping this in mind, this will be a differentiating factor in part 2, by keeping the neighborhood, because a neighborhood has always for us in machine learning and so on, a little bit of information that maybe also informs on the current problem at hand, right? Let's say remote sensing, when we want to determine the class of from satellite images, when I have a pixel which is water, there's a highly likelihood that around the water pixel is also water, right? So in this sense, this is something where we lose a little bit on information of the input. We can do this. We call that reshaping. And then for mathematical convenience, you would also normalize the problem. So these high values, in a way, we put lower and normalize so that we have numbers, let's say, between 0 and 1, which is much more easier to compute. And will then also not get, let's say, out of boundary errors in our data structures and so on. And by doing so, again, we lose now some important information, but it makes us able, of course, now to fill this in our problem with a linear learning model. So basically one long input that you see here. However, what we also have to extend a little bit, and this brings us now to the multi-output perceptron, is now the idea that we have 10 classes, right? So the last time we were talking about Erythetosa, Erythrogenica, we had just 2 classes really. And now we need something like 10 classes, also that's why we call it multi-output perceptron. And with this, we have then basically the idea of adding here a couple of output neurons that are depending on the classes. So the output layer will be a little bit addressed. And we have a sort of activation function we call softmax, where it's going through, where the probabilities really matters of these classes. So in many cases, not always would be it very clear that it is this class or that class. And I'll bring you an example later when we talk about deep learning, and a visual example I also have put into Canvas for some of you to look at. But the other point I wanted to do by doing this, we learn more weights. So we have more parameters, right, that you see here, because everything is interconnected with the next set of neurons, the input layer with the, let's say, new 10 neurons that we need, not only one anymore. So we learn more and more parameters, 7,850. And this will be an important guiding light to show the computational complexity in all of that. Hence, when we execute this, there will be a certain loss function that is quite good for these categories to, let's say, we have a multi-class problem. We call that a categorical cross-entropy loss. That is relating to this idea that I use now an optimizer that is optimized against this loss function, or using this loss function to find the minimum of error. And here you have a nice area where basically all of this is implemented already, using, for instance, stochastic gradient descent that I was already showing you in one of the earlier lectures. If you remember, going basically taking the derivative, but then going basically downhill the derivative with a minus here, having a certain learning rate, meaning of how quickly you go downhill. These are things I already was alluding to in other lectures. So by doing so, and then starting with the learning, really, I put this all in so-called epochs, how often I go over the data set to really work on the problem, learn from the problem. For each of these epochs, I would put the data set parts, so the data set elements, into so-called batch sizes before I do updates in different weights. So this is the next parameter you see here a little bit. And then I specify number classes are 10. That's already obvious to you. The optimizer verbose sends just a little bit of how much output I really want. Then we reshape here the data set and normalize it, as we actually have learned before in one of the more conceptual slides before. That's how the code looks like. Nothing else than saying, well, now we have long vectorized vectors, long vectors really. And then we put that in the learning problem. We normalize everything between 0 and 1. And here you go. And I think assignment 2, when you do that yourself, will also show you a little bit more about this, what it means. But the model then comes from an interesting set in Keras, where I said it's very close to the training idea, adding more and more layers now. And that's what we do in Keras always with a sequential model. We add now this dense layer. You have seen every neuron in the input layer, which we reshaped, is basically now connected to 10 other neurons. And then we add another layer, which is then the softmax activation function, which just gives us probabilities between, these different classes going through it. And then I use a loss function that is particularly optimized then for this, let's say, classification into categories using this optimizer like SGD. And what I'm interested in is, for instance, accuracy. So far it was just preparation. And where you really fit the model, really train the model, where the computational complexity begins, is now to fit this model on the training set. Using this different batch sizes and the number of epochs, how often you go through the data set, and then the computer starts working. So in the moment when you use this with a Jupyter Notebook, at that point in time, when you now actually execute the cell, it will take quite some time. Now we have some model evaluation. That means we can do the same model, the model that we have fitted here. We can also evaluate the model using the test set, right? As I thought in some of the earlier lecture, we always have a train set to really have a model. You remember from the logistic regression pipeline, that was a training process. I end up with a model that exists with the weights that have been learned. And I want to evaluate the model with a test set that I wrote in the corner. And only at the end of training, I want to check how well I am. So I take the test set back and compare the scores. And what we have now is, of course, something that is now depending on some parameters. That's why I want to make this slide again. The number of epochs you really do for, let's say, going over the data set, which is a bit here, but you can overdo it. We call that overfitting. When you start learning and learning and learning with 200 epochs, you will see at some point in time overfitting starts. So the algorithm will know each and every simple sample here by heart. That's what we want to avoid. On the other hand, we also don't want to train too short, that the error is very high. Something like this here, you have a very simple model which not really reflects the data very much. So finding the sweet spot is something where hyperparameter comes in, which we will also explore in later lectures. Hence, that's something also where the accuracy that you see now is incredibly related to this. And when we now see that, okay, when we run this for these amount of epochs and having this multi-output perceptron, we get to 91% performance, and that's not so bad. The question is just now, do we stop here, or what can we add, right? Is there maybe more hidden layers we can add or so? And this brings us now to the idea where you have this linear perceptron model, which we have now as a multi-output perceptron, to put it in layers. You see that a little bit here, like you have still the same input, but instead of having, let's say, just the number of input layer neurons, they are then connected to very many of those in the hidden layer, and then to several ones on the output layer. So you come with a notion a little bit of saying multi-layer perceptrons, because you combine these different single elements, which are still in a way valid. So they get the inputs from different weights and from different connection here in the dense layers, and compute still the activation function for each of this, and contributing to the larger picture of the network. This enables you to have more decision boundaries. So basically adding this, you can see like here, an unsolved problem for a linear learning model, the XOR problem, if you want. You see here one of the cases which in a way is not really linearly separable with one line, right? So you come to a solution wherever you put the line, it will be never corrected. The green are on one side and the red are on the other. It's called the XOR problem, not really relevant very much to you, just to get the message that by combining different neurons together in this multi-layer perceptron, you have a much more interesting surface decision boundary that you can do, and also going towards so-called non-linearities by doing this with nonlinear activation functions. And there are some of them which are in G here. If you remember, some of them where the initial ones were signed, now we really have very sophisticated ones which are often used, like the rectified linear unit ReLUs or the leaky ReLU, for instance, which then have different ways how they treat the data and are critically often used. It enables us, more visually speaking, then decision boundaries which are not just like this you learned in the initial part of the course. right? Which admittedly will be not able to basically have this green from the red separated. But you see here how that could work when you do this iteratively through the data. You come up to quite some sophisticated, let's say, complex functions that you learn from this. And with this, have a much better, higher accuracy. Now, of course, you can imagine you have to pay the price for it, as I always say in each of the different lectures. By adding more and more neurons here and more of these perceptrons, more and more connections, which are all weights, all trainable parameters, need to be learned. And as such, this brings in computational complexity. Another problem that you have here is that you can say that there is no guiding label Y here, right? So when you think about it, we have to go back from here where we know the output, right? Our Y from everything, and back propagate the error. That's what's called the back propagation algorithm. That I go basically with a chain rule that would take now a whole, let's say, one lecture basically in machine learning to tell you this, how that works. But you back propagate the error and update all the weights basically from this stimulus on the input, the signal that you put in. And then over time, by doing this constantly, you adjust the weights, right? You initialize them randomly, you compute the gradients for all of these different weights. Then, and the update of the different weights will be always done using also the learning rate. And then you repeat, and until the epochs are done, basically, and then you report the error. Inherently is, of course, the optimizer used. So basically, you see that a little bit here on the graphic, going downhill, the arrow slope, hopefully leading to a kind of global minima. Sometimes you get stuck in local minima, perhaps. So there are different techniques also against this. Hence, we want to add maybe 2 hidden layers for our artificial neural network now. So hence, from multi-output perceptron, we are now arriving to an artificial neural network, a proper one. We basically have still a number of epochs, batch sizes, that stays all the same. But what we do now is not having 10 classes as, let's say, the next layer. We introduce hidden layers with 128 neurons, so quite substantial elements. And as you see here in the architecture of the neural network, we come back to this in lecture 7.1 and also later in the optimization of hyperparameters as well. This is something you choose, and we choose here 2 hidden layers, both with 128 neurons. Again, when you do this your own in the assignment, it's better to understand. We add here the TANGE activation function or the ReLU. The softmax remains to get the probabilities. And you see here how that works when we run this in a, let's say, Jupyter notebook. And we come up to something called 97%. If you add a little bit with regularization and so on with other parameter elements, we come up to 95%, right? So we improved from the multi-output perceptron to neural networks with 2 hidden layers, with 20 epochs. We have already better percentage in learning. However, for computational complexity, you also have to understand now that we have now 118,000 trainable parameters, right? Compared to the 7,900 or so we had before. Hence, much more computing that is required. At the end, before we now take all these ideas with the trainable parameters and put now the idea of deep learning, I wanted just to conclude this lecture with a short video for you. Again, I will stop here the recording before we then go on after 10 minutes break, perhaps for the next, lecture part.